kerosene lamp on the front desk of the Prairie Rose Inn sputtered low, its flame a tired orange flicker against the dingy glass. Outside, the January wind off the Montana flatlands had teeth. It rattled the warped window frames and sent a drift of powdery snow skittering across the puncheon floor every time the door swung open. The inn was empty. The stagecoach wasn't due until Thursday. And the only sound in the long dark hallway was the wet slap of Thomas Miller's mop against the baseboard. Thomas dipped the mop into a bucket of gray water and leaned his weight against the handle. His lower back ached from hauling firewood that morning, and his right knee, the one that had never healed right after a horse threw him 3 winters back, throbbed with a dull, steady pulse. He dug a calloused thumb into his eye socket and allowed himself a single slow breath. 4 days until rent. The math clawed at him. He was $3 short. And the overtime cleaning the upstairs guest rooms covered maybe $1. If he could pick up a day's work mending fence at the Bar T, that was another $2. It left enough for flour, salt pork, and maybe the bottle of Dr. Hartley's lung syrup for Sarah. Sarah. The name pressed against his chest like a stone. She was asleep right now, wrapped in a patchwork quilt at Mrs. Pembroke's cabin across the frozen creek. He pictured her small face, the way her chest fought for air when the cold wind blew off the mountain, the high, thin whistle of her breathing in the dark. He hated leaving her there. He hated the pity in Mrs. Pembroke's eyes when he handed over a handful of tarnished coins every Friday. But a widowed man with a daughter who couldn't breathe right and a knee that couldn't hold steady in a saddle didn't have the luxury of pride. Thomas hoisted the bucket and moved toward the service stairs. The wheels squeaked against the rough floorboards, a sound that echoed in the empty hallway. His route paper, a scrap of brown wrapping paper the manager, a perpetually sweating man named Griggs, had thrust at him, said he was supposed to finish the ground floor and clock out. But Griggs had caught him near the livery door just before sundown. "Top floor needs a sweep, Tom. Got a mess in the north wing. Don't touch nothing in the main suite. Just empty the ash pails and get out." The top floor, the domain of the inn's owner, Evelyn Croft. Even the hired men spoke of her in hushed, reluctant tones. She wasn't just a boss. She was a widow who had buried 2 husbands, one who left her this inn, and another who had gambled away half her land before a fever took him. She had fought off land sharks from the railroad, fired idle hands without a flinch, and kept the Prairie Rose running while other stage stops crumbled into the prairie. Thomas had seen her once, months ago, when she walked through the main hall in a dark wool dress, surrounded by men in Eastern suits. He remembered the sharp click of her boots on the boards, the faint scent of something clean and bracing, witch hazel maybe, and cold cedar. She hadn't looked at him. To her, he was part of the inn's machinery, a moving shape in a faded blue shirt holding a mop. That was how he preferred it. Invisibility was safe. Thomas climbed the narrow stairs. The air up here was colder. The lamp at the top of the landing had burned out. He strained his eyes against the dark. The north wing door, her private sitting room, was closed, but not latched. A thin sliver of yellow kerosene light bled out from the crack, spilling onto the dusty floorboards. Thomas hesitated. Griggs had said her room was off limits, unless specifically requested. But if he left a full ash pail in the owner's quarters, Griggs would dock his pay. If he went in and disturbed something, he could be fired. He stood there for 5 seconds, jaw tight. The building was silent. Her buckboard was not in the livery, and the stable boy had muttered she'd ridden out toward town that afternoon with her driver. She was probably long gone. He reached out his rough, calloused fingers, gripping the cool brass of the door handle. He pushed it open. The heavy wood door swung inward on silent hinges. Thomas stepped forward, the bucket wheels squeaking once. His eyes focused on the floor to locate the ash pail. He didn't look up immediately. He saw a pair of black leather riding boots kicked off near a braided rug. Then a puddle of dark fabric, a heavy wool traveling cloak thrown over the arm of a chair, and then a voice, a woman's voice, low and ragged, and edged with an exhaustion that cut like a blade. I told you to leave the tray at the desk, Marcus. Thomas froze. His heart slammed into his ribs. He snapped his head up. Evelyn Croft was standing 10 feet away, bathed in the glow of a single brass lamp. She wasn't sitting in the velvet chair by the fire. She was standing in the middle of the room, and she was half undressed. The expensive wool shirtwaist she must have worn all day was unbuttoned, slipping off one pale shoulder. But that wasn't what paralyzed Thomas. It was the fact that her hands were twisted behind her back, fingers straining to unclasp something tight and mechanical wrapped around her torso. A rigid, heavy-duty canvas corset. Thick straps of black canvas and metal boning clamped tightly around her ribs and lower spine. As she moved, her skin shifted beneath it, revealing a landscape of mottled, ugly bruises, deep purples and sickly yellows fading into the pale skin of her ribcage. Thomas didn't move. He didn't breathe. The mop handle in his grip felt like an anchor. His brain short-circuited into primal, terrified panic. I'm fired. Oh, Lord. I'm going to lose everything. Evelyn turned her head, irritated by the lack of response. She stopped. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp and cover herself like some shocked debutante. Her hands simply fell away from the clasps of the brace, dropping to her sides. For 3 excruciating seconds, the silence in the room was absolute house. The faint howl of the wind outside seemed to vanish. Thomas stared at her. Evelyn stared at him. Her eyes were dark, bloodshot at the corners, framed by strands of dark hair that had escaped a severe knot. Her face was a mask of cold, terrifying calculation. She looked at his cheap wool shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the mop bucket, the ash pail dangling from his belt. She looked at his face, pale and wide-eyed beneath the brim of his cap. You aren't Marcus, she stated. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room. Thomas choked. His throat was sandpaper. I'm sorry. The door. The manager told me. He stepped backward, his heel catching on the edge of the braided rug. He stumbled. He kept his eyes locked on her face, terrified that if his gaze drifted even an inch toward the bruises on her ribs or the mechanical brace gripping her torso, she would have him thrown out into the snow. Get out, she said. The command was flat, devoid of emotion. I didn't know you were here. Thomas stammered, his chest tight with panic. The thought of the $3 he needed for rent vanished, replaced by the terrifying image of an eviction notice pinned to his cabin door. I swear, ma'am, I didn't see anything. I was just doing the ash pails. I said, Evelyn repeated, her tone dropping an octave. Get out! Thomas didn't wait. He yanked the heavy door backward, almost tripping over his own feet as he scrambled into the hallway. The door slammed shut with a heavy final click. He leaned against the cold plaster wall, his breathing ragged, loud in his own ears. A cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. The ash pail slipped from his fingers, landing soundlessly on a dusty runner rug. Stupid, stupid, stupid! He squeezed his eyes shut. He had just walked in on the owner of the Prairie Rose Inn. He had seen something she clearly didn't want anyone to see. A woman running a business alone in a territory full of hungry men didn't wear a heavy rib brace unless something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And people with that much to lose didn't like men like Thomas knowing their secrets. He waited for the sound of a door opening, the muffled voice of Evelyn Croft calling for the night man to have the creeping janitor stripped of his pay and escorted off the property. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. The hallway remained dead silent. Thomas slowly bent down and picked up the ash pail. His hands were still shaking. He retreated to the back stairs, practically sprinting, the wheels of his mop bucket screaming as he dragged it toward the cellar. He needed to clock out. He needed to leave before she changed her mind. By the time he stepped into the bitter January air, the snow had stopped, and the moon was a cold sliver behind a veil of cloud. Thomas pulled his thin coat tighter and started the half-mile walk to Mrs. Pembroke's cabin. His bad knee throbbed with every step. He replayed the moment in his head, her cold, bloodshot eyes, the dark bruises blooming against her ribs, the brutal mechanical grip of the brace. She hadn't looked embarrassed. She had looked cornered, like a wounded elk, waiting to see if the hunter would finish the job. He told himself it was over, an accident, a mistake in the night manager's routing. Tomorrow he would probably find his name struck from the work list. He'd have to beg Griggs for a few days' wages and find another job cleaning stables for $1 a day. He reached Mrs. Pembroke's cabin, let himself in quiet as a ghost, and checked on Sarah. She was breathing, light and fast, her small hand curled against the quilt. He sat beside her cot until the candle burned out. The morning sun came cold and white through the inn's kitchen window. Thomas stood by the back door, hat in hand, waiting for the axe to fall. He had barely slept. He had fed Sarah a bowl of thin oat porridge, kissed her forehead, still too warm, and walked to the inn with dread like a stone in his belly. Griggs met him at the service door, clipboard in hand. Thomas braced himself. Here it comes. But Griggs just grunted. You're not on floor duty today. The owner's driver, Hayes, came by before dawn. You're wanted in the main suite. Don't clock in, just go. The floor dropped out of Thomas's stomach. The private suite. They weren't just firing him, they were making an example of him. He climbed the stairs on legs that felt hollow. A man in a sharp gray suit, Marcus Hayes, the Eastern driver Evelyn kept on her payroll, was waiting for him outside the sitting room. Hayes looked like a man carved from cold tallow, but his eyes held a flicker of something almost like sympathy. Miller, Hayes said, follow me. Hayes didn't lead him to a back room to collect his things. He led him straight to the heavy wood door with the brass nameplate, Evelyn Croft. He opened the door and gestured for Thomas to step inside. Then Hayes pulled the door shut behind him. The room looked different in the thin morning light. It was immaculate, intimidating. A fire crackled in the hearth. Evelyn Croft was sitting in a high-backed wooden chair near the window, a wool shawl draped around her shoulders. Her posture was impossibly rigid. Her hair was pulled back tight. She was looking at a ledger, her face unreadable. She didn't look up when he entered. Thomas stood on the braided rug. The silence stretched tight as a clothesline wire. He shifted his weight, his bad knee twinging. I'm sorry, Thomas blurted out, the words tasting like dust. I know I wasn't supposed to be in there. I'm sorry I saw. Sit down, she cut him off. Thomas snapped his mouth shut. He looked at the plain wooden chair opposite her. He hesitated, acutely aware of the stable smell still clinging to his clothes. He sat on the edge of the cushion, his back stiff. Evelyn finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of the bloodshot exhaustion from the night before, but the skin beneath them looked bruised, heavily concealed by powder. You didn't run to the gossips in town, she said. It was a statement. No, ma'am. You didn't tell the manager. No. Why? Evelyn asked flatly. Thomas stared at her. The question felt like a trap. Because I need this job. I scrub floors for $1 a day. If I talk about the owner, I get fired. I have rent. I have a daughter who can't breathe right when the air turns cold. I can't afford to care about your secrets. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. The rawness of it hung in the air between them. Evelyn held his gaze. She didn't blink. Then she reached into the ledger and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. Thomas unfolded it. It was a list, his name at the top. Thomas Miller, 34, widower. Former cavalry until a horse threw him. One daughter, Sarah, age 7, chronic lung ailment, debt to the town doctor, no criminal record, desperate. He felt his face flush hot with humiliation and a sudden spike of anger. You don't get to... I was thrown from a buckboard 4 months ago, Evelyn said, cutting him off again. The sudden shift in topic hit him like a douse of cold water. She leaned back in her chair, the movement painfully slow, careful. I was riding alone out to the south pasture to check on a fence line. The horse spooked. I went down hard into a dry creek bed. The town thinks I caught a bad influenza. My investors in St. Louis think I slipped on a patch of ice. The reality is that I fractured 3 vertebrae and cracked 4 ribs. Thomas didn't say anything. The image of the canvas brace flashed in his mind, the ugly mottled bruising. The railroad is looking for blood, Evelyn continued, her voice flat and clinical. They want this inn and the land it sits on for a depot spur. I've been fighting them in court for 6 months. If the investors find out the owner is held together by canvas and rawhide, unable to sit in a wagon for more than 2 hours without laudanum, the loan will be called. They will pull my credit, and by spring this place will be a rail yard. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Evelyn looked at her own hands. Because I am paying off a private doctor in Helena and a pharmacist in Billings to keep their mouths shut. My driver, Hayes, manages my schedule to hide the days I can't move. But Hayes is a city man. He can't help me out of a wagon when my spine locks up. He can't tighten a thoracic brace without flinching. I need someone who is discreet. Someone who is entirely off the grid of my business circle. Someone who needs money so badly they will do exactly what I say when I say it and never ask questions. Do up and She looked at his rough, chapped hands. I need a handler. Someone to drive me to meetings, stand in corners with my medication, and when my back gives out, hold me upright so the vultures don't see me fall. Thomas let out a short, hard breath. I'm a janitor. I have a bad knee. You were cavalry. You know how to carry dead weight. She tapped the paper. I will pay you $20 a week in silver, board and a small cabin behind the inn for you and your daughter, and I will cover whatever the doctor charges for the child's lung condition. $20 a week. A cabin. Medicine. The numbers hit Thomas like a physical blow. That was more than he made in a month. It was a warm room for Sarah, the expensive syrup from the doctor in Billings, a future where he didn't watch his daughter fight for every breath. What's the catch? He asked, his voice shaking. Evelyn's eyes were dead serious. You belong to me. No days off until the railroad hearing is over in 6 weeks. If you slip up, if you talk, if you look at me with pity, I will make sure you can't get a job cleaning outhouses in this territory. Thomas looked at the woman across from him. He saw the cold control, the ruthless calculation. But beneath the edge of her shawl, he saw the faint outline of the canvas strap digging into her shoulder. She was terrified. She was bleeding out in a tank of sharks, paying the nearest working man to be her shield. He didn't like her. He didn't want to be in her world. He thought of Sarah's thin face, of the frost on the inside of their cabin window. When do I start? He said. The next morning, while the mist still hung low over the cottonwood trees along the creek, Thomas moved Sarah and their few possessions into a small 2-room cabin behind the inn stable. It had a tight roof, a cast iron stove, and a real glass window. Sarah stood in the middle of the floor, clutching her rag doll, and looked up at him with wide eyes. Is this ours, Pa? Thomas knelt down, his bad knee popping. For a while, Bug, and the lady at the inn says the doctor's going to bring you new medicine. Evelyn had not spoken a word to Sarah. But that first evening, as Thomas returned from a long afternoon of learning the buckboard routes and the subtle signals Evelyn used when pain spiked, he found a basket on his cabin doorstep. A loaf of fresh bread, a small crock of butter, and a jar of honey with a treble hook. There was no note, but the bread was still warm and it smelled of yeast and comfort. He was starting to understand the woman behind the cold mask. The work was relentless. Evelyn Croft ran her business like a military campaign. She was at her desk by 5 in the morning, barely able to stand, and she didn't stop until late in the evening. Thomas learned her body's language. When her left hand gripped the edge of a table so hard her knuckles went white, it meant the nerve pain in her spine was firing. When her voice dropped to a terrifyingly quiet whisper during meetings with the railroad men, it meant she was fighting off a wave of nausea from the painkiller. He would step forward, offer his arm, and she would take it without a word, leaning a fraction of her weight on him while she stared down men twice her size. Their dynamic was not friendly. It was transactional, abrasive, and built on silent mutual necessity. Slower over the ruts, Miller, she snapped one icy Tuesday as he drove her buckboard toward a meeting at the county seat. I didn't hire you to test the springs. The springs are fine, Thomas replied, gripping the reins. This road hasn't been graded since last spring. Do you want me to take the old creek trail and make you late for the hearing? I want you to drive without the commentary, she shot back, her voice tight. He glanced back. She had her eyes closed, one hand pressed hard against her ribs, her face gray. Thomas felt a flicker of something, not pity, he knew better than that, but a grim solidarity. Payne didn't care about the zeros on a bank draft. The hardest part came late at night. After the meetings, after the investors left, when the door to her private quarters finally closed, the facade crumbled. Without the eyes of the town on her, the adrenaline evaporated, leaving only the shattered wreckage of her body. It was during the third week that the boundary between them shifted. They had just returned from a brutal all-day negotiation with railroad suits in Helena. Evelyn walked into her sitting room, her movement stiff and robotic. She made it 3 steps toward the hearth before her legs gave out. Thomas caught her before she hit the floor. He grabbed her under the arms, his heavy boots bracing against the rag rug. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound of pure agony, her fingers digging into the sleeves of his coat. She smelled of strong coffee and cold sweat. Don't, she hissed through gritted teeth, trying to push him away. I can stand. No, you can't, Thomas said, his voice dropping into the flat, authoritative tone he'd used years ago in the cavalry. He didn't ask for permission. He scooped her up, his bad knee screaming in protest, and carried her to the padded chair by the fire. He set her down as gently as he could. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. The brace, she choked out, pointing to her ribs. It's seized. The clasp is jammed. Thomas knelt in front of her. For weeks, she had been a voice giving orders from the buckboard seat. Now he was inches from her face. He could see the fine lines around her eyes, the exhaustion carved into her skin. He reached under the hem of her wool shirt, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the plain linen of her shift. He found the cold metal clasps of the thoracic brace. They were heavy-duty ratchets, the kind used for severe battle injuries. The locking mechanism on the left side had bent inward, digging brutally into the bruised flesh of her ribs. I have to force it, Thomas said, looking up at her. It's going to hurt. Evelyn stared at him, her eyes wide, terrified, and entirely human. She nodded once. Thomas gripped the metal lever. He braced his forearm against the rigid canvas, taking care not to press on her broken skin. He pulled. The metal resisted, then gave way with a loud snap. Evelyn let out a choked cry, her forehead dropping forward to rest heavily against Thomas's shoulder. He froze. He was a hired hand. She was a woman who could buy and sell half the territory. He was acutely aware of the cheap laundry soap on his shirt and the lingering smell of horse on his sleeves. But he didn't pull away. He stayed perfectly still, letting her breathe, letting her hide her face against his rough coat. Slowly, carefully, he unlaced the rest of the corset. He pulled the heavy sweat-dampened canvas away from her torso and set it on the floor. She sat back, pulling a shawl across herself, her breathing slowing. The silence in the room was thick and heavy with vulnerability. Have you eaten? She whispered, looking at the hearth rather than at him. The question caught him off guard. It was so mundane, so unexpectedly human after what had just passed between them. He remembered the bread she'd left on his doorstep that first night. Not yet, ma'am. She nodded toward a covered plate on the sideboard. There's supper left. Take it home to Sarah. Thomas stood up, his knee cracking loudly in the quiet room. He picked up the plate. It was warm, wrapped in a clean cloth. He turned to leave, but he heard the rustle of paper. He looked back. Evelyn was holding a crumpled piece of paper that had fallen out of his coat pocket when he knelt. A drawing. Stick figures in blue crayon. A tall man, a little girl with a yellow sun, and a lopsided horse. Evelyn looked at the drawing, her thumb brushing over the jagged lines. Sarah. Yeah, Thomas said, a sudden fierce protectiveness rising. He reached out and took the paper, then stopped. He unfolded it again and set it back on the arm of her chair. She asked me today if the lady at the big house was a queen. I told her you were the woman who gave her the honey. Evelyn's face did something complicated. For a moment, the hard edges softened. Is the medicine helping her? Yes, ma'am, she hasn't wheezed in 4 days. Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the permanent tension in his shoulders. She saw a man who was selling his pride to keep his child breathing. Good, she said quietly. Take Sunday off. Hayes can drive me to church. You should take her down to the creek. The willows are budding. Thomas stared at her, surprised. He nodded slowly. Good night, Miss Croft. Evelyn, she said to his back as he walked out the door. When it's just us, Miller, it's Evelyn. 6 weeks later, the railroad hearing convened in the town's one-room schoolhouse. It was the first warm day of spring, and half the county had turned out. The railroad men sat at the front in their dark suits, flanked by lawyers with oiled hair. The town's women clustered in the back, whispering behind their hands about Evelyn Croft, the cold widow who ran an inn like a man, who never came to quilting bees, who thought she was too good for common folk. For months, they had murmured about her pale face, her careful movements, her strange refusal to ride side saddle or dance at the harvest social. A few had even whispered that she was hiding something, that a woman alone couldn't run a business without something being broken inside her. Evelyn stood at the front of the room, her back rigid, one hand resting lightly on the edge of a table. Thomas stood 2 paces behind her, his broad frame still, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw the moment her left hand tightened on the table, the bone-white knuckles. She was in agony. This was the final, brutal argument she had to make to prove her competence, her stability, her right to keep her land. If she faltered now, the railroad would win. The lead attorney for the railroad, a man named Caldwell, stood and adjusted his spectacles. Mrs. Croft, he said, his voice dripping with false concern, you asked this board to believe you can manage a stagecoach inn and 100 acres of ranch land in your condition. Yet we have heard reports that you are unwell, that you require constant assistance. Isn't it true that you are physically incapable of performing the duties required? A murmur rippled through the crowd. The women's whispers sharpened. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Thomas saw the tremor in her spine, the way her breath caught. He stepped forward. But before he could speak, the schoolhouse door swung open. A small figure stood there, clutching a rag doll and wearing a too-big coat. Sarah. Her face was pink from the walk, and her eyes were wide with worry. She had followed Thomas from the cabin, worried about her father and the lady who gave her honey. The room went silent. Sarah's gaze found Evelyn at the front, and without a word, the child walked straight up the aisle, her boots scuffing on the wood floor, and slipped her small hand into Evelyn's free hand. Don't let them hurt you, Sarah said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. You're the bread lady. Evelyn stared down at the child. Then she looked up at Thomas, her eyes suddenly wet. And Thomas watched the steel in her backbone shift into something else, something warmer, something that had been locked away for a very long time. She looked directly at the railroad men, and her voice came out clear and strong. This is my family, and this is my land. The rumors about my health are lies spread by men who want to steal what I've built. I am perfectly capable, and I am not alone. She did not mention the brace. She did not explain the bruises. She simply stood there, holding a little girl's hand, and let the town see her as a woman who had a home filled with food and people who loved her. The women in the back stopped whispering. One of them, a farmer's wife who had once snubbed Evelyn at the general store, looked at the child and the quiet cowboy behind the widow and saw the truth. This was a family grown from hardship, not blood. The board conferred for 10 minutes. Then the chairman rapped his gavel. The land stays with Mrs. Croft. Case dismissed. The crowd filtered out, murmuring in a different tone now. Caldwell and his men left in a cloud of dust. Evelyn remained at the front of the schoolhouse for a long moment, her hand still holding Sarah's. Then she looked at Thomas, standing there with his hat in his hands. Have you eaten? She asked. Her voice was light, almost teasing, but her eyes were full of tears. Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest. No, ma'am, not yet. Good, Evelyn said. There's a pot of stew on the stove at the inn, enough for 3. They walked back to the Prairie Rose together, the late afternoon sun golden on the new grass. Sarah ran ahead, chasing a butterfly, her breathing strong and even. Evelyn leaned slightly on Thomas's arm, not because she needed help, but because she wanted to. The brace was still there beneath her dress, but it felt lighter now. That night, they ate at the big oak table in the inn's kitchen, the fire crackling, the windows open to the spring air. Sarah told stories about the creek and the willows, and Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. Thomas watched them and realized he was home, not because of the cabin or the steady pay, but because of this, a shared meal, a mended heart, a family built from second chances, and the quiet kindness of a woman who had once been a stranger. Weeks later, when the brace was finally put away in a trunk and the bruises had faded to memory, Evelyn stood on the inn's front porch and watched Thomas teach Sarah how to curry a horse. The girl's laughter floated across the yard. Evelyn touched her ribs where the pain used to be and thought about the night a janitor walked into her room and saw her at her weakest. He hadn't run. He had held her up. He had fed her child. And every evening since, he had made sure she knew she was not alone. That evening, as the 3 of them sat down to supper, Evelyn set a loaf of fresh bread on the table, the same honey bread she'd left on his doorstep all those weeks ago. She looked at Thomas and Sarah, and she said the words that had become their benediction, their promise, their home. Have you eaten yet? And Thomas smiled, buttering a slice for his daughter, and answered, We're about to.